Okay, good morning, folks. Welcome back for day number 2 of Frontiers in Playful Learning. Apparently, we fed you well enough that you decided it was worth coming back for a second go around. Again, for those of you who are new here, my name is Steve Slota. I'm an assistant professor in residence here at the University of Connecticut in the educational psychology department. I focus on playful learning and storytelling in the context of classroom teaching. And this conference is really centered on those concepts. We brought together a bunch of scholars from around the country to have thorough discussions about what works and what doesn't in the course of using games in the classroom. And if you'd like more information about the schedule for today or to access the hyperlinks to get to WebEx so that you can see these presentations in the live stream, you can go straight to frontiers.education.uconn.edu. It also has all the logistical information about what we're doing and how all of this is supposed to be put together. I also wanted to remind people, just so we can aggregate photos and information from folks, what your thoughts are, questions, etc. You can use the Twitter handle @frontiers_2022. We also have a Discord server that is linked on the Frontiers in Playful Learning website. And if you don't mind using the hashtag FPL22 for your tweets and other social media posts so that we can, again, aggregate them and find them when we want to see how people are experiencing things. We focused on this a little bit yesterday for our first plenary discussion, and I'm going to introduce our next one momentarily. I just wanted to allow everyone the opportunity to bring up this Google form that we had been using yesterday for the first discussion. You are free to include as many questions as you want for our panelists up here on the stage, and I will facilitate or moderate this conversation based on the questions you offer. So the way this will work is I will allow everyone to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what they do. I'll tell you all a little bit about what our goals are for this particular discussion, and then we'll use your questions as the basis of conversation going forward. So again, I'll leave this up here for a second in case you need the QR code or you want to type in the tiny URL, which is tinyurl.com/YY86S7WA, just in case you needed that. If you are using WebEx to connect to us, there is live captioning available. So I'm going to be putting that up on the side screens here in a moment so everybody can see those captions in the room. You are free to bring them up on your own computer, or if you're at home, watch the entire thing through WebEx with those captions alongside. Okay, so to speak a little bit about the goal of this particular panel, which if you've looked at the schedule, you realize is called Oh, the Humanity, because I thought it was a funny pun, but maybe not. The reason why I wanted to include this is it's one of the important threads through the conversations that have been happening over the last day or so. And looking at who was going to be speaking and what they were going to be speaking about, it seemed consistent that one of the things that we were all talking about was the nature of critical discernment of information, the importance of the humanities alongside STEM education topics like science, technology, engineering, and math. I personally, and this is a personal opinion, I don't know how the panelists feel about this, but I've always felt that the A in STEAM, when people try to add art into STEM, feels disingenuous, where it's not really there to support humanities education, it's there to make the engineering seem less mathy. And that's not necessarily helpful if our goals as a society are to develop people who are well-rounded and thinking about really complex topics and finding their identity or which ideologies they align with or don't. And I had a really great conversation with Caro yesterday evening about the need for people to understand that history is an active process. It's not a static thing in the past. That the bifurcation we're seeing right now in geopolitics seems to be between something along the lines of social democracy and authoritarianism. And we really need to figure out how are we going to communicate to this generation of people that they need a humanities education to pick apart and deconstruct and understand their place in society and what we can all collectively do to make things better. So we are going to talk about games in education for the humanities specifically, but I also want this to be a free-flowing conversation about what do the humanities do for us and why should we be spending more time and energy and money trying to support that kind of education in addition to the stuff we do with STEM, or at least creating a framework for future students to be able to solve the world's problems with a better understanding of one another and their communities of practice and what that means for them going forward. I also wanted to mention, because one of our speakers left me a thoughtful voice message last night about, well, insomnia, I guess, but also the thoughts that come with it. And one of the topics mentioned was, this is Pride Month. Juneteenth is also coming up. And it's really frustrating in a lot of ways to see the way that those particular topics or identities have been co-opted by corporate entities, that there's sort of this additional disingenuousness of talking about Juneteenth or Pride or whatever, when those institutions themselves are antithetical to what those holidays or celebrations are supposed to represent. So I also want that to be sort of a topic of conversation among our panelists, to think about what is our role in making people understand that distinction between what corporate entities do versus what individuals do versus what local communities do, and how we can potentially solve some of these problems through education, through games, or through games for education. So without further ado, I want to hand things over to our panelists. They can all introduce themselves very briefly. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised with the, sorry, Trent, I don't mean to embarrass you or anything. Maybe your expectations were very low, sorry. So I think you'll be very happy to hear what they have to say, and I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say, because they're all people I greatly respect and whose work I base a lot of my own teaching and research on. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panel for Oh, the Humanity. So give them a round of applause. Whichever one of you would like to go first, we can start with Roger here on the side.
Hi, I'm Roger Travis. I'm an associate professor of classics and ancient Mediterranean studies with a courtesy appointment in digital media and design here at UConn. I work on the intersection between the reception of the Homeric Iliad and help change the configuration of the humanities, so that that crisis, which I don't think extends to the actual humanities, that is, people thinking about stuff from the past and what that stuff means and how it's going to change their lives, I don't think that's in danger. I think our role in it as teachers, especially as academics in the humanities, is in danger.
Started off light. My name is Trent Hergenrader. I am an associate professor of English and creative writing at the Rochester Institute of Technology. My areas that I basically teach in heavy rotation are world building, different kinds of world building, and then a class called game-based fiction that uses role-playing games as sort of the driving engine of the class, where students create characters and then we use role-playing games to have their stories sort of unfold. RIT is a very much a STEM school, and the liberal arts never gets we're the Rodney Dangerfield. We never get the respect that we think that we earn. And the idea too that most of my students are not well versed in the liberal arts or humanities whatsoever. So trying to teach fourth-year students about history, philosophy, literature, and everything else that we want to try and get them to learn in their 4.5 year while they're going out to industry is a tough call, right? Like I wish we could get them these kinds of classes and have these kind of discussions in their first years rather than as electives as they're heading out the door. But anyway, I'll talk about whatever anybody wants to talk about.
Morning. Morning. I'm Drew Ladd. I'm a writer and social critic. I write horror and fantasy novels and short stories. Most of them focus on the reality of the horror of racism in America and things like that. I try to inflect that in my work. And I'm also a social critic. So I have very uncomfortable conversations with white people virtually every day about race and racism. And not the typical ones like white people are bad or racism is bad, but really digging down to like the essential functioning of racism and how we relate, how we can still have positive relationships, even in the context of race and racism and white supremacy and all this other kinds of stuff. And I have a podcast where I try to go to the lighter side of it called Negroes in the Wild, where I walk through my rather wealthy white town and observe white people in the same way that black people observed when white people typically go to where black people live. That's it.
Suguli Sokigu. Dr. Wendi Sierra, ni Yugyats, Anayodaga ni Ahnawa, ni Wagitalod. So I will say, whenever I'm presenting on my work, particularly my work in native games, I like to start with my native language. But also, I'm kind of mean and I sort of wanted to see how it was gonna, oh, it's just speaking another language. That's fair. That's fair. That's the right thing to do. That was a mean trick. So, hi. What I said is hello, everyone. I am Dr. Wendi Sierra. I am Oneida. Turtle is my clan. I am, as of April, an associate professor of game studies. I will take applause. So my sort of academic lineage is in English and specifically rhetoric, but I am now a professor at an honors college where I am a professor of game studies. So every class I teach is games and which is very fun. My research traditionally had been on games and learning, and I still very much play in that sandbox, but I am moving more into native representations in games and native language reclamation through games. So I've made 2 games for Oneida. I'm working on a game for the Wichita as well. I think as that would suggest, I'm very interested in the possibility of games to share underrepresented perspectives and cultures, and thinking about the line between what should be shared in a game and what shouldn't be shared in a game. What parts of a culture might be available for games and what parts aren't available for games. That's very important to us.
All right. Hi, I'm James Coltrain. I'm just finishing up my second year as an assistant professor of game art here in the DMD department at UConn. My training is originally as a historian. I was formerly a history professor at the University of Nebraska with a focus on the early Americas. And I'm also a independent game developer. I have a very small studio called Historiated Games. And you can play our first title, which is called Blackhaven, which is kind of a mystery thriller about a very sketchy colonial plantation museum for free on Steam. And that was made in collaboration with students and scholars at Xavier University of Louisiana.
Thank you all very much. So again, if any of you have questions that you want to ask our panelists as we get going, you can use that Google form and drop them in. I'll be checking that regularly. We do have one starting question, which I think is a really great place to begin. This question specifically says, isn't the division between STEM and the humanities an artificial dichotomy? Isn't the assault on the humanities and their separation from the hard sciences a specific disempowering maneuver in neoliberal universities rather than a general intellectual question? We should share more than we share more in common than one would expect. So who wants to take that first? I think that's a great place to begin. I feel like Roger and Trent probably have some things to say about it.
Yeah, yes. I think that it results from the division that we now have, results from turf wars in which for a long time the sciences, although it scarcely seems something we can in living memory, for a long time the sciences were put in the backseat. And the humanities were ascendant. And I don't think there's any vengeance going on, but I think it's a swing of the pendulum, and I think it's unfortunate, and it actually results from the way that university departments tend to get siloed off from one another. And I'm not sure what to do with that about it without really significant disruption, but we need. At the very least, we need a lot of interdisciplinarity in areas where interdisciplinarity has traditionally not really happened. And I will say at UConn, we have dual degree programs in my department, literatures, cultures, and languages, that allow undergraduates to study STEM and languages in pursuit of careers. And UConn is not the only place this is happening, but it is an area where that kind of interdisciplinarity may eventually start to break down the silos. But we're still talking about 2 degrees, and we're talking about who has control over various pieces of it. So it really just a long yes.
I'm sure I'm probably the only leftist in the room, but I think there's also an economic component to it in that it's one of the things. RIT, for all of its virtues, is also the archetypal neoliberal university. And so much of it is about efficiency and speed and what can be delivered. Lots of great education is messy and slow. We ask complicating questions. How are you going to change the culture of your institute to make it less racist and sexist? Well, those are questions that don't really show up on the positives, on the bottom line, when you're looking at just making money. They take time, they take money, they actually cost money to try and implement. And these are things that if we're looking at education in a neoliberal lens, they're not cost effective. Right? It's like for people in the humanities, it's like, well, that's kind of why universities started. But we're getting away from that. And then especially when you get so many administrators that are making probably more than all of us up here combined, figuring out how to the fourth VP of marketing or whatever, figuring out how to bring more students in, get them out on time, and cycle them through. Like anybody who wants to rant about this, the pandemic really just kind of stripped away any kind of pretense that what we're doing is processing tuition, room and board, and getting them on campus so they can eat the food. And then like education is maybe a second or third priority, right? But we all got to get on the same hymn sheet to make sure that happens. So it's sort of been eye-opening these last couple of years about where the priorities are in higher education, at least from what I've seen.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I think your comment about like how the university is structured against interdisciplinarity, for me feels like the heart of the problem. I mean, they're interrelated, right? Like everything's got to come down to a paycheck. We are incredibly vocationally focused now in ways that are very problematic. But I came out of an interdisciplinary PhD program. And I chose it because it was interdisciplinary. And I was like, this is great. I can take classes in computer science, in art, in education, in English, in comm, right? And so I spent 3 years like, oh, look at this playground. It's so great. I can have whoever I want on my committee. I can do a digital project with my disc. This is fun. And then in that last year when we hit the job market, they were like, okay, but market yourself. You're English. You need to find those roots and find that home, because there are very few places where that playground actually exists in a university structure. And I agree it's pessimistic, and I love to be the happy one, but it's difficult to imagine what a university that really truly honors interdisciplinarity, that just doesn't give it a lip service and a brown bag luncheon, right? Like, what does that look like? Because it's a structural change to the org chart.
It's probably worth saying that when people talk about the crisis in the humanities, there's one number that they're looking at in particular, which is the cratering number of majors in the humanities disciplines. And I mean, I guess for good measure, when you're looking at numbers that the provost's office gives you and you're seeing double majors, if your humanities department isn't the primary major, it doesn't count anywhere near as much. So, I mean, it becomes just a huge structural problem. And I almost want to say, so this is me hedging, I almost want to say that we should do away with what we think of as the idea of a major. And I don't know what that looks like, but if we come up with, let's say we take a less loaded word, let's say we start calling it a concentration, which a lot of places do anyway. We say, okay, here is your concentration, and then we make general education in all of the various ways it's conceived of at various universities. We make that a much bigger part, and we make it much better related to the concentration. And that's just floating one way that this could look. And at least at all the places I've ever worked or looked at, the humanities have a role in general education. And one of the nice things about working at a university is that all of those STEM people who were educated and are educated in very much the same way you are, they don't want to eliminate the humanities. There is nobody including in the administration, who wants to eliminate the humanities. It's a question of hours, and it's a question of how you can structure things. And the problem is, from my perspective, that we're trying to fix something that is, I don't want to speak too strongly. We're trying to fix something that may in fact be unfixable, when in fact we need to work again from the ground up.
Thank you very much. I actually wanted to jump to a similar topic. I think Wendi had mentioned universities paying lip service to some things. And this is a question for Drew, Wendi, and James, I think, because all of you in different capacities have thought about the way that you integrate information into these virtual environments for people to interact with. And I'm kind of curious, what are let me frame it this way. Last week, Blizzard Entertainment released a chart that showed that they were increasing diversity in their games, or balancing diversity based on numerical values assigned to race, ethnicity, gender, sex, all of these other things. And they did it as a positive. They thought this was a good advancement. And I don't think any of us up here would think that is what constitutes. That's why I'm directing this question to you, is it sure seems like that's something you need the humanities to address, because you can't quantify people's qualia, the things that give them their identity. So, Drew, I know you probably have very strong thoughts about this, and I'm going to pass it to you first, but I'd like to hear from all three of you and get your take on, like, how do you build environments that are actually welcoming and culturally sensitive without just assigning a number to a human characteristic?
Okay. Excuse. So that's the first time I'm hearing of that, which is surprising because I follow gaming like rather closely. I should be shocked by that. It's super gross, but I'm not. And it's weird to say that I'm not, right? Because you'd expect that things would progress, especially now. Like, it's 2022, and from the time like when I was born, the way that games are, you would expect there to be some kind of. It's just not. I'm still honestly trying to process that. Like, I don't understand even what the goal is, assigning a numerical value or whatever to representation. But the goal, I think, in trying to get people who aren't often represented, and that's just non-white, non-straight people, is to really get like who we are as humans, to communicate more of the human experience rather than just getting this generic white perspective or this generic perspective. And Blizzard, with all of its problems, I can't. I'm sorry, I'm trying to answer and process at the same time, because it's like there's always this game of, we have some things that feel like gains, and then there's this revelation that comes with whatever step comes next that demonstrates that we really haven't made a whole lot of gains. We've just learned what the new rules are, and rather than getting down to like, how do we really treat each other like humans, and how do we really connect with that so that we don't have to learn more rules? Instead, we do things like come up with percentages for how people are included. I don't know whose idea that was, but I kind of have a feeling whose idea that was. I'll stop there. I can go for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a very difficult question, because I think a lot of times, Drew was talking about people trying to establish rules. I think rules are very difficult in art, and it also is always just almost a matter of execution rather than principle, whether something works or not. And a lot of times it has to do with audience reaction, including from the people who you're thinking about representing, how they respond to that. And so, as a historian, when I think about, where to get kind of the landscape of representation in a historical portrayal, I mean, I start with just who was there. And I think that one of the biggest things that's often just overlooked in American history is just, there's the dominant narratives that we're familiar with, because those are the ones that were publicized. And there's the actual physical people who were there, who were doing the majority of the living in different places. And sometimes just looking at that to start is important. I think the other thing is, history is difficult because if you're very far back in the past, there's no one we can go to who has an authentic representation of that. So we're all kind of working from a collection of evidence. But if we're doing anything in the present where we do have people that have these exact experiences, then the most important thing is to talk to them. So, in my game, Blackhaven, our protagonist, is an HBCU student. So we worked with an HBCU school, and we had a panel of students look at all of our character Kendra's dialogue and talk about how they themselves would react to that. And the other thing was that we empowered them. We told them that they would have the final say on what this character says, rather than we're just taking their advice, that they're active participants in that project. And I know that Wendi has dealt with a lot of similar things working with the community, so maybe.
Yeah, I think that, historically, we didn't ask Native people or involve Native people in game design, and that's how we ended up with Custer's Revenge. If you don't know it, don't Google it. And just a whole slew of tropes that were drawn from Western film and TV and media. And mid 2000s ish, I think there was a start to be like, well, maybe this isn't great. There's still some of that out there for sure, but then we kind of hit this era where people said well, let's hire a Native consultant. I don't know, let's go ask one of them, right? And so you get Killer Instinct, who actually went and talked to the Nez Perce and found out that their skin is not the color of ketchup. So that was a good step one. But they went and they talked to the community and found out well, what would you want in terms of the clothing and the costuming, and maybe every Native character shouldn't be Chief Thunder Hawk Wolf, right? There are other words that we use. And we got Assassin's Creed 3, which I briefly mentioned the other day. They kind of made this weird statement about sure, he's Mohawk, but don't worry, he's still an assassin. His Mohawkness doesn't, you won't be scared, white man who plays this game. You'll still connect, right? And so that consultant model, it moved us forward, but it still had some challenges. And I think that now what I'm most excited by is indigenously determined games, which are communities having substantial say over what's going on. So the one that everybody kind of always points to is Never Alone, where the tribe fronted the money and had a ton of the input on the game design process. But there are lots of indie games by Native peoples that are very cool. And that's where I get excited, because I feel like they can be creative and experimental and really engaging properly with culture in ways that Assassin's Creed is never gonna do, because it's Assassin's Creed. It's a behemoth, and it's not bad that they have Native characters. That's good, but I'm also not expecting a Native story out of them. So I don't know. Maybe this is a cynical take again, but I question the ability of monoliths to do anything profoundly game changing. I'm much more excited by communities.
I think that points to something really important about goal orientation and what is the institution's goal or the organization's goal in producing this content, which ties to another of the questions that audience members submitted. Do you see the possibility of digital entertainment becoming not a tool for teaching the humanities, but a central topic of the humanities itself? Imagine a high school English class that values the text of a game with the same respect as written literature. And I saw that and thought to myself, well, that's what it should be. But the other part of it is being able to give people more choices to make that decision easier. So when I was in high school, you get a bunch of reading list materials from your English teacher, and they say you read these 7 books because they're going to teach you something important about yourself or the world. And I don't see personally any reason why that can't be the case for games too. It's just a question of how are those games being developed, and not necessarily explicitly instructional, right? It's not like Math Blaster or whatever for English, but instead thinking through how do we create games as texts for this purpose of being used in classrooms to make those kinds of salient points that, you know, formal traditional literature always has. So I'm going to pass that over to all of you and see what do you think about this idea.
I'm just laughing because at my previous institution, I was in an English department and I taught, I think I called it Stories, Games, Tell. And the way that I pitched it is like, instead of the American novel, you're taking Stories, Games, Tell, but like we're honoring the narrative in games and we are looking at how games convey those narratives in different ways. And to their credit, my department, like, one, let me run that class, and two, patted me on the head for doing it. Like, good, this will fill seats. Very pragmatic, get those numbers, FTEs. At the same time, consistently, I got the impression, but this is that weird thing that you do. The real work is being done in Chaucer. The real work. And so I felt like there was a sort of, it's cute that we can do this, and especially if it will, you know, create minors. Oh man, you get that one class that hooks them, you create a minor, and then we put them in the class where the real work happens. And so I think that the legitimacy of game as text in certain corners is not where I would like it to be.
It comes down to hours. And those hours are especially precious at the high school level. But they tend to be in general education curriculums, no less precious at the post-secondary level. But I think the answer is absolutely yes. It's just that everybody's getting a decreasing slice of the pie. Chaucer's slice is decreasing radically in order that literature, but Toni Morrison's slice increase as it should. I think the slice of games will increase, but at a certain point, you can't slice the pie any finer, and you have to find other ways. You have to find other ways to reform the curriculum. At the university level, it gets easier, and I will say that I teach Knights of the Old Republic alongside the Iliad, and it is, as Wendi was saying, it's regarded as that thing I do. But there it is alongside the most canonical of the canon. And I think that's the way it has to go forward. And I think where we really need to go is a post-canonical place. And at that point, Chaucer isn't going to be untaught, and Knights of the Old Republic isn't going to be untaught. But the way we think about how we put a curriculum together is going to change.
As you're transitioning, I'll just make a point. Somebody had shared as a matter of just information, UConn recently voted for a common curriculum for general education that's designed to be interdisciplinary and organized around the themes rather than disciplines, which seems to be one way of moving forward with that, such that you're getting students the opportunity to be able to figure out for themselves what kinds of information do they want to consume or what kinds of media make the most sense for them. But that's, again, just one approach, and I want to pass it back all over to you.
Yeah, I'll go straight back to the economic questions too. So like when UConn says that that's what they're going to do, my response as a faculty member would be, show me the money. Show you how you're going to fund that. Show me how you're going to create situations in which my FTEs won't just count towards English, but towards something else. Show me all of those calculations, how you're going to measure whether, sorry, I'm sounding pissed off. How you're going to measure this as successful or unsuccessful before we even go with the press release. But, you know, I'm sure faculty are finding out by the press release that this is the way that, you know, the marketing people have decided we're going to go. The other thing, too, that I think happens quite a bit in talking to different people, because the things that I do in creative writing are all about networked writing and using computers and digital tools and things like that, which was back in the 2013 or so when I started was very radical. Now it's less radical, but it's still sort of like the fringe. But you get hiring committees that hire tenure track faculty, and there are a lot of people who are on their way out who say, I want to hire a replacement. I may have taught Chaucer, and I'm going to hire the last Chaucer scholar to carry on my tradition. And because I am 75 years old and a full professor, I get to choose who's on my committee with me, right? And that's the way academia works. When you're like, in 2013, when I came out and I'm like, I do games and role playing and all this stuff, it's like, you're a junior faculty member. Shut up until you have tenure, right?
I just want to revise something. It's not going to be the last Chaucer scholar. It wouldn't be, because part of the problem is that we're turning out way too many Chaucer scholars. They ideally, those scholars would be scholars, fine, of Chaucer, but also of games. The problem goes all the way down. It's especially true in the way that we're producing humanities PhDs, unfortunately. I mean, for the market we have, which should not be the market we have, given the needs that we have for the study of human values, but for the market we have, we are producing way too many humanities PhDs.
Well, how are you going to teach freshman composition if you don't have your grad students?
Precisely. So, I mean, it's the structure.
Thanks. I lost my train of thought.
Seems like a really bad time to announce my next game, the Canterbury Tales. I think that games as text in classrooms are hopefully kind of inevitable. I think some of that's going to improve just generationally. We look at the numbers of people who are playing games, the types of people who are playing games. It's diversifying both in the types of people and the numbers of people. So I think that's positive. And I can imagine that just as it's very common to see in a history or literature class now, maybe a graphic novel assigned along with a lot of regular novels, that we might see a game or two assigned. So I think all of that is coming, and I think that works well in classrooms. I think something that is a little more complicated is the idea of humanities games as tools in classrooms for a variety of reasons. One of the tough ones is that, as much as we talk about breaking down barriers between disciplines, there are specific priorities of disciplines. And so if you are a historian, the primary reason that you are being employed is not just to persuasively teach all of the things we already know about history, but to make new persuasive interpretations about what happened in the past and hopefully come up with a clearer picture. And whether or not a game is going to be the place where those are implemented is a little stickier question. So, one problem is, can games meet the demands of the academic humanities as opposed to things like public history? And then the other difficulty is that there's a lot of humanities scholars who are interested in games who have not at all put in the time to actually understand games. And I have talked to, I won't name any names, but a number of historians who are like, I'm working on a history game. And it's like, oh, that's great. What are your inspirations? And like, well, I don't actually play games. Okay. And I have been in that conversation 4 or 5 times, and you haven't heard of any of those games because they're all terrible. And, it's just as arrogant as saying, well, I never read a novel, but I'm going to write one. It's probably just a long story, Yeah. And so the groups of people who are able to produce humanities games as tools are probably going to be somewhat rare and probably involve a lot of people that have cross-disciplinary training. So it's not impossible, but I think games as tools is going to be less common than games as texts.
Yeah.
Sorry. I just wanted to add on to that. It's also worth thinking about how, as an academic, a game that you make is valued. I know in my own portfolio, my games are not what was valuable for tenure. It was the grant that I got to fund the game. It was the award that I got for the game. It was other people doing scholarship about my game, right? It could have been a game about anything. That didn't matter. So honoring game design work in the academy is something that I think that we could do better about, because otherwise who's going to want to put the time into doing it, right? Like, if this isn't the thing that gets me tenure, if this isn't the thing that helps me keep my job, why would I do it? So
Yeah, I think too, while we're talking about games becoming, within our teaching canon or whatever, in a time in which we literally have people burning books, seems kind of, it seems like there's a couple different things going on here. But I teach a class in transmedia story worlds, and the thing that I've used so far has been Star Wars. And the idea is you read some novels and you learn how novels tell stories. You watch TV, you learn how TV tells stories. You watch movies, you see how movies tell stories, play games, whatever. And the idea is how do each one of those things contribute to this coherent story world? And there's also a commercial side to this, in which how are these stories sold, marketed, who are they marketed to, who are the audiences? So you get things where it's like, well, maybe that show that was a Star Wars show for 8-year-olds wasn't meant for the 55-year-old white guy who's complaining about it on Twitter. Like maybe there's a mismatch there in audience and expectation and all of these things. So everything is for me, right? Exactly. But most of my students too that'll get jobs in the games industry, I think it's important for them to understand, how does a fictional story world work? How can you add to it in meaningful ways? How can you bring your own personal experiences and then incorporate that into a game, as opposed to hitting a quote on a spreadsheet, something along those lines. And I'd say, I don't know, I'd hate to take a vote to see where faculty fall on that. There were a lot of snide comments because I was in the course proposal. It's like, oh, well, you could do this with The Witcher, right? The Witcher's transmedia, and Tolkien's got some transmedia things going on. And, there's some eye rolling from what I heard in the curriculum committee, like, oh, these are the texts that we're teaching now, The Witcher, right? And I'm like, okay, but you really can't do a Toni Morrison transmedia story world, because there's a commercial aspect, and these things really only started picking up steam, after World War II, during this massive economic and digital expansion, right? So one of the other things too is that you think about the generational divides, in which I was born in 74. So we had D&D and the Atari 2600 in my house. And we just kind of kept playing games and kept doing. That wasn't true for people who were even just 10 or 15 years older. And they have a completely different idea. When I say I use games in the classroom, there's often this snore. How do you use Monopoly in the classroom? And I'm like, well, number one, I could. But number two, I don't. That's not at all what I'm talking about. So I think there is this generational divide, and then that generation is still in charge of the committees, still in charge of the budgets, still in charge of the marketing, still in charge of the hiring. So I think that all these things move slowly, and we will get there, but it's not going to be as fast as anybody would probably hope. Yeah, I know, right? I know. This is the problem with humanities people, right? So how can you fix it for free?
So, Drew, I'd be interested to hear from you, as somebody who does a lot of writing in science fiction and horror and these other areas, to make a point. What is your take on the use of games for this purpose, as somebody who does other kinds of media creation? And if you were to make your own game, what would that look like?
If I were to make my own game, what would it look like? No, that's a much more difficult question than I thought. Honestly, I'm not sure.
Maybe another way to think about this would be, what do you think the affordances are of the literature you create versus the kinds of affordances of games, and where do you see there being overlap between those?
I just couldn't understand you.
Oh, I said, what do you imagine the affordances are of the kinds of literature or art you create versus the affordances of digital tools like games? And do you see that overlapping, or do you see it as two disparate kinds of creation?
So I think I'm able to be a lot more, well, in the stories I write, I'm able to be a lot more consistent and pointed in my message or direction and things like that. In games, like my favorite, Destiny 2, which I've been playing forever and ever, you're able to have a whole bunch of different experiences, even with the same general narrative and the same characters and all this other kind of stuff. Me going through a raid, for example, twice with different groups of people is just a completely different experience, even though it's the same mechanics and the same story and things like that. Whereas in a book, you're really trying to get more of this one person is telling this one particular story, even if it's about this giant world and all these other kinds of things. So you're not really trying to have this collaborative experience. Even in one-player games, right? It's a collaborative experience somewhat, in that if you play something like Witcher 3 or any of the Souls-likes or whatever, you still go and have conversations with people about it in person, online, and things like that. And that experience is more group than, well, like Stephen King's It, which I've read 1,000 times, but it's always only me and that book. Did I answer the question? I hope I did.
I mean, I'm satisfied. So, to return back to the initial part of that, if you could make your own game, what would it look like? I want to extend that to all of you. I mean, some of you have made games, and they all look very different. And how do you think about the creation of those products as people who work in the humanities? What are the things that are informing your thinking about that? And I've worked with Roger previously on text-based role-playing. I've worked with Trent with respect to world building, and Wendi, I'm very familiar now with your work, which I think is fascinating. And James, we're colleagues now, and I've learned a lot about Blackhaven in that time. And so all of you have taken a very different approach based on the discipline in which you work. And I'm assuming there's a relationship between the teaching and learning objectives of those disciplines and the type of pedagogical approach that's baked into your games. I'm curious if you could each explain how you made those kinds of distinctions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is always, what do I want players to get out of this, right? Like, what's the purpose of this? And then once I know the purpose, then I can start to think about, where is it going to be played? How is it going to be played? Am I talking a digital game or a physical game? Am I talking a RPG, or what am I talking about? So I made a conference game called Seize the Day, which is a terrible pun because the conference is called The Seize. So it's C''S, Seize the Day. That's great. We're going to trademark it, make tons of money. We're not. We identified at like this big national academic conference, it was very easy to feel isolated and all alone. And how could we address that? So we came up with this idea for a game. It's sort of like basically a scavenger hunt, and then there are a couple other activities that you have to do. So not the most innovative thing mechanics wise, but it does a couple things. First of all, we have a booth. So if you don't know anybody, it gives you a place to go where somebody's going to like smile at you and be happy to see you and want to talk to you. We have badge flare so that if you're wandering around the conference, you can identify other people who are playing the game, and then you can go up to them and talk to them. And then we do things like, well, this isn't a thing really anymore, but we try to share some of that insider information that if you're a lone attendee, you might not know about. So like we had a quest, go to a publisher party. Well, publisher parties aren't very publicized. They're like not official. You have to know somebody. But if you see the quest, well, now you know that there is a publisher party, and then you can start talking to people, figure out how to get to the publisher party. So we tried to do a lot of things like that, prompting people to take actions that like maybe they don't even know that they're supposed to be taking at the conference. Publisher parties aren't really a thing anymore because publishers don't really care about English professors anymore. That was a beautiful heyday moment for a while there. But like that's not the game design in it isn't startling, but it does the thing that it's supposed to do, and it's really successful at doing that thing, right? And then A Strong Fire is an entirely different type of game, because the audience is different, the way they need to interact with the game is different, our expectations and goals for them are different. But the question is always like, why am I doing this and who am I doing it for?
Yeah, I kind of think of it as a literacy, games as a literacy. And as somebody who teaches, right, if a person who is literate can both read and interpret a text, but then also produce their own. So I'm less interested in, like, I know why I want to make my games. I know why I want to make my stories, because I've done enough work to figure out who I am, what's important, and when I want those things to be expressed in a game. So I really like really low, lightweight, tabletop, like, because we were talking about this before, they all want to make Skyrim for their senior projects, right? And that's not going to happen. You don't have the team, you don't have the budget, but you could dream about what Skyrim might look like. So just write that down, right? Start thinking about what it would be, and then talking about things like, well, how is representation handled in your game, this game that you've got an infinite budget for? So just thinking through, or like, can you take a game that you like playing and then skin it with an issue that you care a lot about, right? So you don't need to be a game designer, you just need to know how a game works, and then think about how you could change the rules or change the titles on the card to, be able to express yourself, something when you look at the world and something that you see that wants change or you want to tell people about. Can you use a game to do that? And the answer is not always yes. So maybe sometimes it's writing an essay. So maybe sometimes it's making a YouTube video. And I really see my role as a college educator as being able to help them develop those literacies across whatever it is, being able to understand whatever media that they're looking at, that they can look at it critically, and that they can join the conversation and get their own voices in there in a way that will be effective, right? I mean, this is sort of like the just basic rhetoric, but it's expanding. And this is where people are like, how do you know how to do all that stuff? I'm like, I don't really know. I'm not like an expert in all of them, but I'm sort of like an expert in thinking and talking about it. So let them be the expert on how to make a YouTube video or a twine game or whatever it is. I just want to put the bare basics and say, just think about, like in a twine game, what choices are you offering? What choices are you denied when you're playing these games, right? And just getting them to think about those things, because I'm less worried about them as creating products as 21 and 22-year-olds, and more thinking about how can I get in your head so you will think about the process for the rest of your life, for every game that you make, for every company that you work for the rest of your life. But, you know, Chaucer.
I make text-based story games for my courses. And what I always think about to start out with is how do I make the victory condition and the learning objective as close to the same as possible. So if it's a course about Herodotus and Thucydides, the story the students are playing is about how they, putting themselves in the place of an ancient Athenian, would help their Athenian friends understand what's going on, the same events that Herodotus and Thucydides interpreted in their own way. It's very simple, but it results in a moderate degree of role playing. But more importantly, the key learning objectives of the courses, which are generally detailed analysis and culturally contextualized analysis, being able to summarize what Herodotus and Thucydides are talking about, that can come through in a way that does seem to engage the vast majority of students at a deeper level, even if they don't do a ton of actual role playing in the course of it.
I think there's a lot of different sources of inspiration when we're talking about the way that we come to making games. And I think all of them are valid, from being like very foundational and meaningful to being kind of playful and one-off. When I think about how Blackhaven came to be, you know, one big part of that was just looking at established genres. So I was super, super inspired when walking simulators became a thing, because I always liked in first-person shooters the points where in between killing everything that you would get to see, like, oh, here's the nice little space where these people live. Here's a little world building and culture. And so when people started doing only that as games, I not only thought that was really cool, but also, you know, there's a practical aspect to that, which is walking simulators are almost all in empty places because they're made by small budgets, and animating characters is really expensive. So you have to come up with an excuse for something to be empty. And that means you're almost always exploring and looking for clues of something that happened in the past. And it's like, well, that's exactly what a historian does. And so this is a very historical mode of storytelling. So seeing a game like Gone Home or Edith Finch or something about that, it was very easy to think, oh man, this is a great storytelling device for history. There are also inspirations just in the form of like direct experience. You know, like I did an internship, or a summer fellowship rather, at Colonial Williamsburg on architecture, and I was going to plantation homes for architectural reference. And it's just a very surreal experience to be in a private plantation museum where you know that 400 to 500 people were owned by the people who own the house, and there's no reference to that in the historical presentation. As a historian who knows about the realities of that, that's very disturbing. And I thought, well, there's a little kernel of something that could be transferred to a game. I also, just in my own inspiration, you know, I started doing 3D modeling of historic sites and stuff like that. And I just love seeing things that I only read about primarily in text come to life in a 3D environment. And so that's another point of inspiration. And but I think you can get it from anything. You know, the next game that I'm working on, it's a totally different tone. It's about Paul Revere's Ride and the way that that has kind of been reappropriated through successive generations and historical memory. And the entire reason that I'm doing that game is because there's a Grant Wood painting of Paul Revere's Ride, the guy who painted American Gothic. I just think it's a really cool painting. It's got a little guy on a horse, and I thought I'd really like to see him move, you know? And so I think there's all kinds of interesting historical work that's going to be done in that game, but the inspiration for that is I like this one painting. And I think that that's just as useful a place to start as anything else.
Excellent, thank you. There are two things that jump to mind as all of you were speaking. One of them is the importance of good instructional design, starting with a needs analysis, figuring out who are your stakeholders, how are you going to satisfy the things they actually need you to teach. And even if, as I was saying earlier, games don't have to explicitly teach, they don't have to be designed as Math Blaster or something else that you specifically put in a classroom, but game designers and teachers have very similar jobs where you're trying to communicate to people specific kinds of learning objectives and then helping them achieve those through scaffolding. So that's one thread I keep going back to, this idea that you have to just do instructional design to be able to succeed in these kinds of projects. The other piece is the metagame and the responsibility of designers to think about what do players think after they play, or how do you deconstruct the experience itself? I like that James mentioned walking simulators because they very much help contribute to that kind of thinking in the same way, and we've spoken about over the last couple of days, the Dark Souls From Software style games that lead you on through the absence of information, that it actually encourages you to explore the space, to make sense of it on your own, and that deconstruction that you do with other people in a community of practice is incredibly important if you want to successfully teach an idea. And I don't just mean that in the sense of how to do a physics problem, but broader cultural ideas, the importance of small d democratic institutions, that sort of thing. We are coming up on the end of our time together. So the last thing I wanted to do is just ask everybody for sort of a parting thought to carry forward through the next day or day and a half, or maybe even beyond that. Things that you think are important for folks who might be listening to this later on to take away from it, and what you would do to empower the humanities to the extent that games can afford that. Good luck, Roger. You're first.
I would love people who are here in whatever capacity and watching in whatever capacity to think of ways that we can disrupt the models. I mean, I don't know. Trent tends to be much more economic than I am, and I know there's no money in thinking of how to disrupt the models. And no, I mean, people are going to try to take away your money for trying to disrupt the models. But in the future that we have to reach, where we're thinking about human values really all the way across the curriculum, what does that curriculum look like?
Yeah, I think for me, anybody who wants to put a quarter in me about what happened in Wisconsin after Scott Walker got elected, just sit back, because I will go. I was in grad school at that time. But one of the things that I think, and I don't know how this will happen, I think there needs to be dissolving the walls of the university, especially for the humanities, and get way more into, so I did K through PhD public education in Wisconsin. So it's really hurtful to see that whole system getting trashed. But we need a way to reach 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds that maybe they're not going to come back to school to get a master's degree, but expand the university out into our local communities and make it free, or make, something to be able to get people where they don't feel like, I hated my English class and I'm never going to read another book again, right? And book clubs are fine, but like professors leading a discussion about literature is different. And I think we need to find a way for people to realize that universities are amazing spaces where there's so much knowledge that's happening. But like at my school, it's almost entirely for this 18 to 22-year-old set. It's 70% male, right? I mean, there's all these things where it's like, okay, can't we do more to go into historically ignored neighborhoods and provide community learning and create a sense of value for that, just knowing about the world, being curious about the world, making humanities knowledge accessible, like all of these things, extending it to senior citizens seems way, way important for universities. If they're concerned about funding, let's increase the value of what universities do rather than calculating how the government and schools are in bed together to make sure that they can extract as much tuition out so professors can get rich, which seems to be what happens in the comment section of most news articles about the cost of higher ed today. It's always rich professors that are ruining things. So that's my short answer would be, let's open it up. And this is why I think games too are such a great way. Games are typically not seen as being institutionalized. So that's a way for us to be able to go out and say, hey, look, you game, we game. How can we talk, about all sorts of different cultural aspects of games?
good. I honestly don't have anything to add, like what he said. Please. That's perfect.
I think that optimistically, ideally, what the humanities ask us to do is to think critically about context and about community. And in a lot of ways, those can be things that games ask us to do, but they're not always things games ask us to do. And so I would just suggest that thinking about the context that you are creating in your design, and if it is one that needs to be created and shared, would be point one. And then thinking about what communities you are responsible to explicitly or implicitly, and if the game that you are making is honoring that community in the way that it ought to be. Again, optimistically, ideally, that would be what I think humanities could bring into games, and also what games could bring back into humanities as well.
Yeah, I would just say if you want to be an interdisciplinary game designer, the most important thing is you need interdisciplinary fuel. So if you're primarily in game design, read history. It is a boundless trove of the human experience. I always say that I have never experienced writer's block because I steal shamelessly from history. That is an endless font of inspiration and ideas. And the other thing is if you're a humanist, like I said before, you have to play games and play lots of games. Don't just play, niche games or artsy games, play Mario, play Dark Souls, play Wordle. Okay, you play all sorts of things. All of those are potential points of inspiration. Just the broader trove of fuel you have, the better product you're going to produce. And more importantly, you're going to have the literacy to be able to talk to other people. We're all talking about, you need an interdisciplinary team, but it's your job to still know every part of that puzzle, or you're not going to be able to effectively have discussions with those other experts.
So know everything.
Yes, the most important takeaway, know everything. Perfect. All right, we're going to transition to our next set of presentation sessions. Before we do that, I want everyone to thank our panelists for their insights. Thank you all very much for doing this. And again, we're going to transition to these breakout presentation sessions that are listed on the schedule. For those of you watching remotely, simply go back to the schedule of events on the Frontiers website and click the appropriate title, and you will be taken to the WebEx breakout for that session. We'll take about a 10-15 minute break, and we'll see you all upstairs. Thank you.